Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first policy crunch of 2021. My name is Rhonda Moore. I'm a practice lead in science and innovation here at the IOG, and I'll be your moderator this evening. But right now, it's my pleasure to introduce our president and CEO, Toby Feife.
Good evening, everybody. And as Rhonda said, welcome to our first policy crunch of this year. As she mentioned, my name is Toby Feife, president and CEO of the IOG. As most of you will know by now, a nonpartisan nonprofit think tank located here in Ottawa. But before we get started, particularly for those of us here in the national region, we must pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. A long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in the region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. And we acknowledge the traditional keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. So Policy Crunch is the IOG's free virtual monthly speaker series that explores the themes of disruption and innovation in our professional, personal, and political lives. And it's, I think, an absolutely amazing topic this evening. What's happening to our legacy technologies and services? So now allow me to introduce our moderator, Rhonda Moore. She is the practice lead for science and innovation at the IOG and our moderator this evening. Rhonda?
Thanks, Toby. And welcome again, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you join us this evening. So for those who have been to Policy Crunch before, you'll know we divide our evening into 3 parts. In the first part, our panelists will provide some introductory remarks, 5, 6, 7 minutes each. In the second part, we take questions from the audience. Audience members can submit their questions via the Zoom chat, on Twitter using the hashtag #PolicyCrunch, on our Policy Crunch Slack channel, and in the YouTube chat, of course. We've got staff monitoring all of those vehicles, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. At 7 p.m., we wrap up the conversation, we switch off the live feed, and for those in the Zoom room, we sort our speakers into breakout rooms. Audience members are invited into the breakout rooms with the speakers, so if you didn't get your question answered in the Q&A, you have a second opportunity. We aim to be done and dusted by about 7:20 when we say so long until next month. So before I introduce our speakers this evening, I want to take the opportunity to offer some reflections on the topic of legacy technologies. Simply put, legacy technologies are those that are outdated in one way or another. They may have been replaced by a new technology, or they're no longer supported by the original manufacturer. This is a topic that comes up often in conversation at the IOG, whether in our learning programs, our research, or around our virtual water cooler. And I expect it's a topic that everyone who has joined in this evening flirts with from time to time, whether they realize it or not, because it's a huge topic that encompasses many facets, and tonight we'll explore a couple of them. Really, anytime we think about whether we should keep or upgrade a piece of technology in our lives, from a mobile phone to a kitchen stove to a programmable thermostat, we are contemplating our relationship with technology. We are deciding where or how to prioritize our tech resources. Do we invest in maintaining something that is 5, 15, or 50 years old, or do we let technology fall into disrepair until we are forced to replace it or go without? If that sounds a tad philosophical, then you're right. There is a great deal of philosophy in the area of technology policy, and we may spend a few minutes there this evening. When we think about technology, we are considering everything from the small pieces that fit into our pockets, to the appliances in our homes, to the large infrastructure systems that shape our communities. We are not examining the topic of technology in a vacuum. Rather, we shall discuss the dance between science and society, or society and technology, and maybe take some bets on who is leading that dance. So with that, our panelists. Our first panelist is Sean Boots. Sean is a policy advisor with the Canadian Digital Service, an active member of Ottawa Civic Tech, and he is one of the brains behind the meeting cost calculator. Sean is going to approach the topic from a public policy lens and discuss technology through the lens of priorities and resources. He's also going to examine the impact of the impact that COVID has had on some of our legacy technologies, and how COVID has brought to light issues of equity and inclusion in Canada. Our second speaker is Anna Adamek. Anna is a director of the curatorial division at Ingenium, Canada's Museums of Science and Innovation. She is a historian of technology and an instructor at Carleton University. Anna will introduce some ideas of technology and culture to our conversation and talk about the different relationships that technology makers and technology users have with legacy technologies. Our third panelist is Willem Klumpenhauer. Willem is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto's Transit Analytics Lab. He studies transit reliability, performance analytics, access and equity, and emerging technologies such as autonomous transit vehicles. I also have to say today is Willem's birthday, and I wish you a very happy birthday. Willem is going to talk about legacy tech and services in transit and transportation and introduce us to ideas of push-pull technology and how transit and transportation have shaped our communities. So with all that said, I'm pleased to hand it over to Sean.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Rhonda, and thanks everyone for being here. So maybe to set the stage a little bit, it's handy to think about what comes to mind when people say legacy technology, kind of like Rhonda was saying at the start. If someone says legacy tech, I think about like COBOL mainframes, those big room-sized computers in NASA documentaries, or like, car phones from before there were cell phones, or if anyone remembers like GeoCities websites with like the blink tag is a huge deal in like 1995. I really liked, Rhonda, your description from the intro, which is sort of legacy technologies are outdated in one way or another. They've been replaced or they're no longer supported by the manufacturer. For some reason though, especially in large organizations, like government departments, we're still using them. And usually when the legacy tech or like legacy system term comes up, it's in the context of we're still using this because we have to, even though it has a bunch of downsides, like it's hard to use, it's unreliable, but we're stuck with it. And that's sort of like the jumping off point for what I want to talk about today. And there's a few themes to it that I'll jump into. So the first of those is legacy tech and legacy systems are a characteristic of organizations, not the technology themselves, which might sound slightly confusing, but maybe as an example, you can think about something like, it's like the summertime and people are driving around in like classic cars. It's like a 60s or 70s like automobile. It's like beautifully done, like humming along, super classy. And then sometimes, I mean, especially here in Whitehorse, you see like cars that are total clunkers. They've just been like driven into the ground. No one has ever changed the oil. It's just like sounds horrible. It's like totally sketchy. The car is like super beat up. And if you think about it, those two different cars they're the same system. They could even be the exact same model of car, but one of those was actively maintained, like humming along, and the other one wasn't. And in the same sort of way, there are car owners who take good care of their cars, last for years, and there are car owners who don't. And either way, it's not the car's fault. And it's the same with technology systems used in large organizations. There are organizations that keep their software and systems up to date, keep them continually like improved all the time, keep it really nice and fresh. And there are those, like a lot of government departments, who just let something sit there for decades after it's built. They only do the bare minimum to keep it running. And legacy systems are essentially, they're kind of like a symptom of organizations that don't keep their systems up to date. And they get that legacy label once there start to be consequences for what the organization can and can't do. Maybe they can't support a new program or business process. Maybe they can't talk to external systems that they really have to talk to. Maybe they really depend on a bunch of like clunky manual data entry. And everyone blames the system. It's like, oh, it's COBOL's fault. But just like the car that's in really poor shape, it's not the system's fault. It's the organization that got it there. That's the first theme. The second theme is to make decisions that make it easier to change in the future. In my case, I work in government tech. And one of the classic problems that people in my field make is that they treat technology and software systems the same way as other things that governments buy. So like highway bridges, office chairs, Navy ships, stuff like that. Things that you buy once, and then at least theoretically, they're good to go for 20 or 30 years. Software isn't like that. The computer software isn't like that. And the reason for that is that it depends on human behavior. Human behavior is unpredictable. It changes over time. And for software that powers government services, like applying online for program, what those services need to do changes as society changes. And sometimes society changes really quickly. That's sort of 2020 in a nutshell. COVID hit, and at least sort of in the government world that I work in, two things happened at once. the government very dramatically changed how it worked day to day. And then at the same time, the government, what government was expected to do, going from like normal business to suddenly responding to a global emergency, that changed very quickly too. And, things like working from home, collaborating with colleagues on like online services that are far away, delivering crucial benefit programs using IT systems that are sort of barely holding themselves together. There's some really great stories of public servants rising to the challenge, delivering really important benefit programs, learning to collaborate in new ways. But there's a lot of other stories of things, grinding to a halt, especially that depended on paper processes that were still locked in a filing cabinet somewhere in the National Capital Region, or anything that needed a VPN anytime from like March until like mid-May maybe. And the question is like, how do you build technology systems that can handle that kind of dramatic pivot? And basically you plan on expecting things to change, which isn't something that governments usually do well. There's a really great quote from Dave Thomas, who is one of the writers of the Agile Manifesto. He's a software developer. And he wrote, when faced with 2 or more alternatives that deliver roughly the same value, take the path that makes future change easier. Take the path that makes future change easier. And so there's a lot of things worth doing to make future change easier, like avoiding vendor lock-in, using open source software that you're free to change, having in-house teams, building interoperable systems. But let's just say governments don't typically take those approaches, and they probably should. And the last theme, and really the most important one, is that there's a human cost to legacy systems, and there are inclusion and equity arguments that people often don't think about. This really showed up over the past year when the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden, across the United States and Canada, really around the world, government websites and applications and mainframes crumbled under the pressure of tons of people applying for, EI benefit programs like CERB all at the same time. And I think in my own opinion, the thing that's easy to forget is that these systems were clunky, unreliable, hard to navigate the whole time. But suddenly it's a problem because, a bunch of middle-class white people are losing their jobs and having to apply for government benefit programs for the first time. And then it becomes a political issue. And really, delivering reliable and high-quality services to people who need them should have been a higher priority all along. There's a really great quote from Pia Andrews, who's a legend in the government tech world. She says, "We burden the marginalized with the most bureaucracy." And to my mind, that's the bigger question, and it's not a technology question. It's how do we make it easier for people who need government support to access it? How do we reduce barriers to benefit programs? And how, like as a society, do we become more comfortable with, on the one hand, a few people getting benefits that they shouldn't, so that on the other hand, it's easier for everyone who actually should get those benefits to actually get them. So that's kind of a starting point. Legacy tech is a characteristic of organizations. It's not the fault of the systems themselves. You avoid that by making decisions that make future change easier. And doing this is important because otherwise we're making it harder for people who need help the most. So maybe I'll leave it there and pass it on to the panelists.
Thank you, Sean. That's a really powerful quote from the non-Wendy's Dave Thomas and from Pia Andrews. Thank you for those. Anna, please go ahead.
Thank you, Rhonda. We are asked to consider this question: what's happening to our legacy technology and systems? And it's a very good question, but it is a very complex question. So first, we need to acknowledge that we are having this conversation in a very specific sociocultural, economic, political context. So the answers that we are giving will apply to this affluent democratic Western society, but they may not apply to other contexts in other countries or even across Canada. In remote communities, we probably would be having a different discussion. That's because technological systems, as my colleague mentioned too, are complex sociocultural constructs, and we have to consider them as complex sociocultural constructs. So when we consider why a technological system becomes a legacy system, we often talk about cost, efficiency, security, lack of compatibility with new systems. We may be talking about withdrawal of technical support. So these are quite immediate reasons to replace one system with a newer version or with an innovation. But from a point of view of a historian of technology, these issues do not always best represent a larger process by which a technology becomes obsolete. So some issues that we need to consider have to do with that negotiation between a maker and a user, manufacturer and the consumer. So when we look on the manufacturer side, we need to consider the issue of built-in or planned obsolescence. So this may be especially visible in current computer or communication technologies. So as companies come up with strategies to grow, they will plan on replacing the technologies regularly. They may pass it on to us as kind of a positive upgrade. You're getting new phone, you're getting new features. Or it could be through that negative reinforcement we heard about withdrawing the support, technical support for the system you have. But in fact, this built-in obsolescence is part of a business plan of companies. Then we have the socially driven change to meet certain social expectations. So for example, early electrical appliances were designed to consume. They were built to consume electricity when the lights were off. Now we require technologies that are efficient, that will not consume energy. Hence, redesign of those technologies. Accessibility and inclusion became values in our society today. So that may be a driver for a change. This could be on a large national scale. We can be looking at the national electrical grid and access to the national grid for remote communities, or it could be technology that someone uses to overcome a disability or help to overcome a disability. Social ideas have impact. Social idea of progress, however we want to define progress, lead to technological change. Good historical example is a replacement of wooden airplanes with metal airplanes. There was nothing wrong with a wooden airplane at the time, but aluminum and steel were seen as symbols of progress. So that was the driver for the technological change and the obsolescence. On the consumer side, we see a strong emotional attachment to technologies. Very often before we even have the new technology, we love it, we hate it, we may be afraid of it. Historical example, first electric lamps were often shaped like candles, just to provide consumers with a bit more comfort. There is a response to marketing. We see that especially since 1950s. When the consumption goes up, the rate of obsolescence goes up. Economic correlation. New consumers' products are often introduced and purchased. We see more purchases during the time of economic growth and stability. That rate of obsolescence may fall down during economic downturn. We also see a broader socioeconomic change. So we acquire new roles and we need new technologies, or we need to adjust our old technologies. On a large scale, a good example is adaptation to introduction of a car. And I believe my colleague will talk more about this situation. On a more individual case, we can think of 1920s housewives who suddenly couldn't afford servants and they had to do their own house chores. And they required a redesigned high-end Art Deco iron to do the ironing. We actually have that evidence in material culture at the museum. And then there is the question of what happens to our legacy technologies. Some become obsolete, some become collectibles, vinyl records, good example. Some may come back in another form. So perhaps we don't purchase radios as much as we used to, but the radio comes back as a cell phone. A streetcar may come back as light rail, windmill as a wind turbine. So all that to say, we have to perceive the whole complexity of the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I've already got questions for you, and I love that you touched on the emotional nature of technology, because as someone who collects vinyl records, I feel very strongly about them. And there's like these interesting communities that exist around certain legacy technologies. And anyways, more fuel for the Q&A. Willem, please, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, for sure. And I just based off of what you just said, I've definitely had the experience of, you talk about transit with anybody in any city and they ask you, oh, my interaction with transit is this, and often it's less than positive, and can you fix it? And it's way worse in this city than anywhere else, and it seems to always be worse in every city. So I don't quite know how that works out. But I'm going to step kind of into a bit of a case example by focusing on transit and going a little broader or a little more broadly and complex, I guess, than some of the stuff Sean was talking about, but maybe less philosophical than what Anna was talking about. Because transit, in terms of technology and service, it's a really large, complex system, and things change. And interestingly, sometimes things change really fast in the transportation sector. Like Uber is a really great example of that, and often things change really slowly or not at all. And so we'll touch on that a little bit. So, in terms of transit, I wanted to just sort of highlight some examples of new technology that has emerged and maybe changing things. And then we'll talk a little bit more broadly. So the first example is battery electric powered buses. This is a very new sort of technology that's emerged. It is fundamentally, as Anna mentioned, it's the same thing. It's still a bus. It still functions like a bus, but it has big implications in terms of energy use and climate change. It provides a smoother ride. It's quieter. It can be more appealing to people. And so, that's an example, I guess, of a technology that is just sort of a direct improvement on something that exists. The other is that there's a growing, especially in Canada, there's a growing number of what is called on-demand transit or transit demand responsive transit services. And formerly what they used to be called was dial-a-bus. And what you would do, and there's still service, or they're just sort of starting to replace these services, is you'd call the bus driver ahead of time, a few hours ahead of time, and say, I need to get picked up and brought here, and he'd try and figure out a schedule. Well, now there's apps and there's cloud computing, and there's a fair bit of smartphone prevalence in Canada. And so now you can basically perform the same function, this flexible routing, changing your routes, adapting, but things can happen instantly. They can respond directly to demand. And transit systems are really quickly adopting this new version of dialing a bus. And of course, that produces some issues with who has a smartphone and who can access transit with this, and there has to be ways of making sure that it's still a service that's available to everybody. And finally, there's a lot of sort of excitement, and I would use the word hype around automation and autonomous vehicles and driverless cars and driverless buses. You've probably heard of futurists talking about a time where car ownership is a thing of the past, or transit even is a thing of the past, and we'll all just have these vehicles that will sort of appear when they may need to appear. But a lot of that sort of thinking ignores a really important fact about cities, and this will sort of transition a little bit, is that a driverless car is still a car, and it's still two armchairs and a couch surrounded by a metal frame. It takes up a lot of space, and it doesn't really matter how good your technology is. You can't change the laws of geometry and the laws of mathematics in that sense. And so cities tend to be successful. The sort of reason that cities are so successful is because it brings people together, and people are close to each other. They interact. You have all of these wonderful interactions. But of course, you still need space to move around. And so you have this push and pull. And in North America, because of the sort of space and the time at which things were being developed, there's a lot of very auto-centric design. So the automobile is kind of this example of a technology that is sort of prevalent everywhere. It is being updated, and as you can have a nice old car, or a nice new car, or a bad new car, or a bad old car, but the impact, the sort of longer term and permanent impact of the way we've designed our cities is a bit of a legacy service or a legacy thing. And when I think of legacy, I think of words like outdated or subpar, or still using them because we have to, as Sean mentioned, and things that depend on human behavior. And so I think we've kind of been digging ourselves a deeper hole, and there's still this momentum, this inertia that we have with the existing way we design cities to to build more highways, even though there's lots of evidence that that doesn't actually help with congestion. And we get this bit of technology lock-in with the automobile, which again is bad for climate change and safety and health. And circling back to the access and equity, has been very, very obviously very bad for sort of urban justice. I think I'll leave it there for now. I'm sure there's some questions.
Yeah, oh boy, are there ever questions? Okay, so I think moderator's prerogative, I'm gonna start with a question to the whole panel that I'm gonna attempt to knit a few things that you each touched on, this notion of equity and how technology can be a barrier to it, whether it's, you know, designing cities to have lots of crescents so they're not walkable, so you need a car to get around. And what does that do for people who can't afford cars or can't afford to maintain a car? And then, you know, in Ontario, for example, we have to have our emissions tested every 2 years. And if your car fails the emission test, then you can't drive it till you repair it. And that can be quite expensive. So I'm just wondering if, you know, question to all three of you, can you share a specific example, or if you have any interesting data on what kinds of barriers, like examples of tech barriers that exist that promote that, you know, that lack of equity and kind of the economic or social impact of that. Maybe Sean, we could start with you.
Sure, yeah. I think like for thinking about like government sort of online services, which is sort of my field, is like web accessibility is the one that comes up very often when things like, if you can't use it just with a keyboard, if you can't use it with a screen reader, then it's very easy to make websites and online services that people literally can't use, which is obviously something you should be avoiding. And sometimes those are a bit more subtle than just sort of like the sort of like very obvious things of like, does it work without, you know, without a screen? Can you like use a screen reader? And one really interesting example of this is from a couple of years ago. The Federal Immigration Department launched a new program to apply for, I believe it was for family reunification visas. And they switched from a lottery system to a first come, first serve system. And on paper, it seemed like a really good idea. They actually used some really good technology to make it scale, which has historically been a problem for a lot of government services. Like they like crash under the load. But what it actually meant is, because there was a very limited number of spots and tens of thousands of people interested in applying, the people who got through to actually get their visas were the people who could fill out the form the fastest. And what that meant is that then if you're using any accessibility tools, like waiting for your computer to like read out the text for you, or if you were just, you know, not as literate in English or French, you know, not as sort of like computer adept, it would just take you longer to fill out the form. And by the time you finished, you know, I think the program was full 11 minutes in, and everyone after that was put on a waiting list. And of course, that just meant that the people who could fill out the form the fastest, you know, their families got visas and other people didn't. And so they've switched it back to a lottery program. And that kind of goes to the point of like, you should be building your tech that's flexible enough that you can change gears if something like that happens. And you're like, wow, we should not do that way. But it's just interesting because, you know, that could have easily met all this sort of typical web accessibility requirements, but without thinking through the sort of like broader sort of experience of, you know, putting yourself in the shoes of people actually filling out that form. You know, 8 in the morning, applications open, you know, 8:11, it's too late. That excludes people, and it's easy to forget about things like that.
Absolutely. Anna.
Thank you. That is an excellent question because it draws the difference between an innovation and invention. Invention by default would exclude, inherently it excludes people because it's something new. It's something that requires us to develop new skills or imagine the world with that invention in it. Innovation may improve on what we already have. So it's going to be much more inclusive. Good example that I'm thinking a lot recently about is a car. So cars, when they were first introduced, definitely they excluded whole social groups, gender groups, accessibility was not there, economics, you know, you've got everything built into a car. But then very recently, we had a conversation with some members of the Canadian Council for the Blind. And one of those members said she cannot wait for the self-driving cars to be on the market because that is going to open up the world for her. So we can see how that technology that was so exclusive at the beginning may actually become may actually open up the world, may open up the accessibility.
That is fascinating. Willem, before we go to you, I just want to share, I had the fortune to have a tour of one of the GM research centers north of Toronto. And the gentleman who was giving the tour actually talked about the long-term plan of General Motors, that they're envisioning a future where people don't own cars, but they own shares. And it's sort of like a pay-per-use system where you don't own a car, but you own so many hours of car use per month. You pay into car use, so we don't need individual insurance anymore, but also has pretty strong implications for like mechanics and technicians and for, you know, gearheads who maintain older classic cars, access to replacement parts. And then where do they drive on roads if you know, if roads are populated by automated vehicles? Anyways, that's a whole kettle of fish. Willem, please.
Absolutely, it's a bit of a kettle of fish. I was going to flip the question a little bit and sort of ask, well, what are there barriers that have been created by technology, which I guess is a little bit the angle I was going with cars. The opening up of the world, I always like to sort of prod a little bit and say, well, is it really that people need, you know, a car to be free, or do they just need to be, do they need mobility and access to, you know, mobility that works for them to be free? And I think it's interesting to see the long-term effects of a thing like a car in terms of the way there's been really great innovations in making things safer with cars. And, you know, cars are definitely much safer than they were at the beginning. And, you know, automated vehicles can bring a lot of access to people, but there's also this sort of externality and this side effect that has been created by them. And it's sort of, they kind of at odds with each other, because by making things, you know, by making the car more successful, you're kind of taking away from other things as well. And there's big equity and inclusion problems with that as well. That, you know, just the fact that a curvy suburb, which really a car doesn't see any differently, as a driver doesn't see any differently than a, you know, a gridded city, is just sort of the worst possible way you could design a neighborhood for transit use, you know, if you're going to design it to make good transit. So it's interesting to see those two at odds.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Okay. There's loads of questions here. So I'm going to go to one from Carl, which reads, technology shapes people's unreflective behavior in various ways and demands adaptation. Are there examples of the pace of change outstripping our adaptive capacity? And what are the social risks? Who would like to take that one? It's a great question, isn't it?
Start with,
yeah, go ahead, Anna.
Oh, thank you. I can start with more of a philosophical approach again here. So immediately I was thinking about two different theories in history of technology. Actor network, where you have your technology may be one of the actors. There are other actors in it. Environment may be an actor. Humans, of course, are actors. And in that approach, the technology is given a bit more agency. There is another one that's social construction of technology, where it is definitely where humans have that agency over the technology. So I guess the answer to that question would really depend which methodology you want to use. I don't think there is one simple answer.
Fantastic. Willem, did you want to weigh in?
Well, I was just curious. I mean, in many ways, I find that technology always sort of makes us outpaces our sort of capacity to change, and then it's very much the human sort of condition to try and adapt to that and be resilient. I think, you know, there's lots of technologies, and we keep coming back to the car as a metaphor, but, you know, people didn't really understand what to do with them, or even, you know, things like the steam engine. They just sort of are these big jumps forward, and then people have to sort of scramble to figure out how to do it. And then I guess there's the flip side, which I think COVID would be a good example of, is when there is a change, and can technology then adapt to accommodate that. And there's been some innovations in that space. So.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I was trying to think of an example where a technology ahead of its time actually resulted in a market failure because we couldn't adapt quickly enough. And I think it was called the Belmont. It was a really early, it was like the first electric car. I may have the name totally wrong, but I recall that it existed briefly, like in the sort of late mid 50s. And of course, there was no uptake for it because like the infrastructure was just not there. Okay, cool. Thanks for that, guys. And I should have said too, like, we've got loads of really great questions. I've been throwing them all at all three of you, but don't feel like you need to weigh in on each question. So, so I'm going to go to a question now from Toby, which reads, could someone on the panel, anyone who would like to, speak to the impact of culture and the move away from legacy systems? For example, why is it that the medical profession, in Ontario at least, finds it hard to let go of the fax machine, even though there are far superior technical tools? Who would like to take that on? Yeah, I know, I'm looking at Anna too.
I was pointing at Sean, so.
Anna, you can go first.
No, actually, I went first last time, so go for
Oh,
it.
no problem. Okay, nice. Yeah, I feel like culture is such a big piece of the legacy systems or legacy technology puzzle. And I think there's a lot of different kind of like angles that you can look at that from. Just sort of part of it is like Anna was talking about, sort of like emotional attachment to technology, or just like the comfort of staying with the thing that you already have. I think there's this sort of like a general sort of like public service like norm or stereotype that like change is intimidating. You know, if it goes wrong, you get in a lot of trouble. If it goes right, no one notices. So the sort of incentives really reinforce things staying the same. There's usually a really big power gap or like hierarchy or sort of like distance between people who are affected by how a technology works and who is empowered to make decisions about what technology happens. And one of my favorite blog posts is from Leah Lockhart. She's a lady in Scotland who like talks about digital government stuff, and she writes this blog post that basically talks about how bad government technology trains public servants to have low expectations of what technology can do. And because the public service tends to be quite insulated from the rest of the like technology world, those same people, you know, 20 or 30 years later are now making decisions about what IT systems to procure or like whether or not to replace an old system. And their entire career has trained them to have low expectations of what's actually possible or like what's easy versus what's hard. And so, yeah, so I think culture is like, that could be a whole conversation, but I think a lot of the sort of like incentives and sort of structures of the public service reinforce a resistance to change. And it's only sort of major sort of catastrophes or near catastrophes, like suddenly everyone has to work from home because of COVID, that can actually provoke changes that are really necessary, but that are easy for everyone to sort of like push down the future until suddenly you really, really have to. Anna, maybe over to you.
Thank you. Change is a process, and it is an overlapping process. So I think what we sometimes perceive as maybe resistance to adapt a new technology is still part of that process. It doesn't take a year. When you look back, you know, when you look back for 100 years, that change didn't take a year or two. It may take a decade. So I think what we are noticing now, since we are in that technological revolution, yet again, you know, electrification was one, information technology is another. We are still seeing lots of that overlap. So that would be part of my answer. But then there is something else that keeps coming back to me, and it's the post-consumer society. I don't think we are there yet, but you know, from the post-industrial society, we moved to the consumer society, and maybe we are moving now to that post-consumer society, and that definitely will have impact on how we adapt technologies. And maybe my colleagues could comment on this.
I mean, I've definitely seen the same thing that as Sean has mentioned in transit agencies and as well. I mean, as government agencies in one way or another. But I think the difference between the people who experience, you know, the technology and the people who have the agency to change it is a really interesting comment. I once I've heard some transit advocates speak of things as sort of trying to turn the Titanic with a a canoe paddle. And that metaphor pops into my head all the time with any kind of change that for a big complex system, right? There's a lot of inertia, there's a lot of momentum. Maybe the Titanic is a bit macabre for that for that metaphor, but it does turn it. You put a canoe paddle in there and it's going to start turning the ship, but it takes some time, and it's sometimes the change is imperceptible. But again, when you look over a long period of time, you see that kind of thing.
I love that image of changing the course of a cruise ship with a canoe paddle. And I think also that probably speaks to the complexity of some of these massive systems and how you need, like, the change kind of comes in like a wave. Like one person alone is not going to have the impact. You need like a whole bunch of people behind that. And I think to Sean's earlier point too, one thing that like it strikes me that we will never have we need a culture of lifelong learning and willingness to learn and to try new things before we will have a culture where people are willing to, be put into situations where they need to experiment and where it's okay to fail. And I know, these are things that come up often in a number of topics. We're, reticent to look like idiots. We're reticent to fail. We're reticent to waste money or perception of wasting money. But that is how we learn. Absolutely.
I think I was going to mention that earlier, that a lot of this involves risk taking, right? And being, the potential to fail and the fear of the unknown or what a new technology might bring,
right.
Makes it easy to play the safe game and to not jump in. And, humans are very, very bad at estimating risk and evaluating risk. And the more complex it is, the worse we are at it as individuals.
Totally. Well, we're biased and emotional and really unpractical. So yeah, it's a great combination. Okay, I've got a really great question from Ryan, and it's a long one. So hang on. So this question is for Sean and anyone else who wants to comment. One of the risks that we've seen emerging with legacy technologies is the loss of access, not just to the data, but to the technologies themselves as systems evolve so quickly. I've seen the observation that for future historians, they may have an easier time getting records from the pre-digital era on physical mediums like paper, tablets, versus digital data on mediums like floppy disks that become obsolete quickly. Do you think government needs to become more active in actually regulating new technology to ensure it can be preserved and archived into the future? And how do we do this without inhibiting innovation?
It's a great question. Yeah, my colleague Lucas, who's like studied archives, would be way better suited to answer this. But I think there's a few angles on it. One is that the sort of like Willem was also talking about, for technology, one of the really important things about avoiding vendor lock-in, where you've got like all your database, like all your information is in this database from 1996. There's no way you get it out. Like that's a frequent problem for governments. And I think one of the solutions is that when people are buying or choosing what technology products to use, if it's not, goal number one, at least goal number two should be, how do you get your information out of this again? Like, it's only just a matter of time until you have to bail from that system to a different one, whether it's in 2 years or 10 years or whatever. And a lot of the time, especially for a lot of commercial products, there aren't really easy ways of getting your data out. So that's one kind of part of it. I think the question about sort of like, is digital sort of like inherently worse at this than paper records are? I think probably, experts in archiving have probably different opinions on this and can definitely answer this better than I can. But I think it's safe to say that like paper records, in practice at the scale of government, like we're not really great at that either. And that's like an example of a friend of mine who's a public servant who asked for, an ETIP copy of his own citizenship like application when he moved to Canada, and it came back as this like incredibly poorly scanned PDF that you can't even read. And it's like, that's not like that was paper, but it wasn't paper in a way that was useful. And I think that's something that happens pretty frequently. And I guess the only sort of other angle on this that is something that, when I see it happening, I'm just a huge fan of it, but it's sort of any sort of like volunteer, putting my like civic tech hat on for a moment, but any kind of like volunteer efforts to generate or like request open data from governments, to like massively scrape government websites, there's like organized communities that do this, like archive team in the States, you know, as the Trump administration was ending, they put together this massive effort to like scrape data off of websites like the Environmental Protection Agency. So just like super interesting efforts to like archive these and then put them in places like the Internet Archive where someone else is figuring out how to keep this around and keep it accessible for a really long period of time. And that's not a perfect answer, but you know, anything that can get government data out in the open where search engines are finding it and other people are like copying and pasting it places, like that can only help. So maybe I'll leave it there.
Well, you're getting a few thumbs up from the audience, so well done. Anna, a variation on that, like, can you tell us how at the museums you actually, like, how do you do that? What's your secret?
This is such an important question for museums today, and we are having lots of discussion on how to preserve that this type of material. When a material culture becomes digital culture and an object is not really an object anymore, it's the software. Very easy to interpret a coffee maker from 1920s. What are historians going to do 200 years from now with fully automated coffee makers? So we have lots of conversation about trying to preserve those digital born objects. There are challenges. I mean, of course, some softwares we just print, and we are going to keep a printed copy of the code behind it. But to give you an example, a few years ago, we acquired a whole bunch of modern technologies, modern domestic technologies to represent the household in the 21st century. And we tried to obtain the software from companies, and the software was still proprietary. So they were not willing to share that with us. We may try to come back to these companies, 10 years from now, they may not exist. So in the museum world globally, we still do not have answers, but we have lots of working groups on the topic.
That's fascinating. Okay, we've got a question here from Robert. It's a question for Anna, but I'm gonna invite Sean or Willem if you want to weigh in afterwards, please feel free. So he says, really glad the issue of planned obsolescence was raised. Very often technology becomes obsolete mainly for economic gain, for profit, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, and not to provide consumers with significant advantage and at significant environmental cost. For example, you could build a car that would last 50 years, but no one would want to buy it. The production of new car can have an even bigger environmental footprint than the possible gas efficiencies of using it. What do you think?
Yes, I mean, I think that you did answer your own question there. You provided a great answer to the question. That planned obsolescence was not always there in technologies. At least this is what we see from the material culture examination and evidence. It's very much linked to globalization and to the loss of craftsmanship too. But the loss of that pride of making your own object. So when technologies were made locally, well, they tended to be much better quality. Now globalization, of course, impacted the quality. The built-in obsolescence came into that process. But that takes me back to the question that I already posed there. Yes, that definitely in a post-industrial society, when we stop producing, we start consuming. Someone has to consume a lot and those technologies have to break so we can replace them. But what happens when we become post-consumer society? Will there be a change in the quality of the technologies that are provided to us? And I understand some do have to change, some do have to be updated, but why is a range in the house breaking every 5 years now when it used to break every 25 years? Or a refrigerator.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so many examples. I think we can, if we opened the floor and asked everyone to turn their microphones on, I'm sure we could all come up with an example of something that we're hanging on to and with loving care because we don't want it to break. We don't want to replace it with something that we perceive will have, that will be less well made. And it's a slippery slope, I think, once you start to fall down that. Okay, very cool. So we have another question from Walter, or sorry, a question from Walter. This is our first one. And he says, Zoom and the like is an example of strong attachment to technology, i.e. attachment to flat screen display to turn into legacy as we evolve toward new virtual presence reality tech, which more closely mimic the legacy but more natural in-person brick and mortar events. Actually, don't see the question there. I think I just read you a comment. Sorry. All right. Okay, this one is definitely a question. Like the strategy of making decisions that keep our future options open, what other thoughts do you have on how to reduce technical debt in the form of constraints, risks, and cost for government and society?
Yeah, happy to answer that, but I would love to hear other folks' points of view as well. I think like there's a lot of sort of like philosophy around this in the sort of like in the software engineering world of like how do you make things that are more interoperable, easier to change. And I think this is like when you think about legacy systems, like one of the main goals is how do you make it easier to replace parts of a thing rather than making it kind of like an all or nothing switch. And that's not how at least a lot of government software has historically been designed, where it's sort of like you have like this one big database with a bunch of customizations built onto it. You know, if you change one thing, it might break 8 or 11 other kind of interconnected services. And the sort of approach to that, there's a couple of sort of like software engineering sort of like phrases, but one is sort of this like entanglement pattern. And you can find blog posts about it, or it's also called like a strangler fig pattern, because the strangler fig tree is a kind of tree that grows around the like the trunk of a different tree or something along the lines. Not a tree person. And essentially what it is you create sort of like an in-between layer where sort of like, you know, if people are going to the government website, rather than going directly to your complicated legacy system, you go to some intermediary layer in between, and then it sends that message along to the system behind the scenes. And so then over time, you can kind of watch what's going in and out of those systems, and you can use that to sort of, you know, chunk something off to your new system while you leave the rest of the old system going. And this is, of course, like the classic mistake that governments make, and Phoenix is a really good example of this, is the sort of like the light switch approach to launching a new software product, where you like flip the old switch off and you flip the new switch on and you assume that everything will work great, and it never does. And so the takeaway is basically doing as many like small scale incremental changes as you can and breaking large systems into smaller pieces, so you can replace like one piece at a time. Thoughts from, yeah.
Yeah, I can extend that into, you know, I had to Google, I'll admit, I had to Google technical debt, which I'm reading now as basically making the short term, what's the cost of making the short term benefit decision instead of the long term play, which, you know, in planning is of course a huge thing. And I think the costs are often harder to nail down of making the short term decision, and we often try to focus on, you know, slightly upgrading what we have now, making a road wider, you know, tweaking this or that a little bit, rather than thinking, okay, what are all the factors that are causing this problem and what is the long-term solution to it? And even though it won't give us relief at this exact moment, how do you sort of try and look into the future? And I think there's a bit of a shift. In the past few decades, there's been a bit of a shift towards, we need to look at the long-term, you know, effects of that, and to really try and capture, I think that, and this maybe circles back, is that you have to really try and capture the costs accurately. And it's often really hard to capture. It's easy to capture how much money it costs to build, you know, a subway, but it's really hard to capture exactly how society will benefit, how many fewer people are in the hospital, how many, you know, the economic benefit, all of these things that are much slipperier to catch. So I think one way to do that is to just get better and do more research on how to try and capture that kind of benefit, and then to also believe that research in this day and age too.
That so because you opened the door to transit systems, and I think, you know, as Canadians we have this like dangerous habit to constantly complain about things, and we love complaining, and you know, apparently every transit system in Canada is just terrible. I might go there in Ottawa because we love bashing our public transit system for some reason. but we don't love having detailed conversations about the complexity of a transit system that supports more than 1 million people, or the complexity of changing, of making a massive, like this is a huge planning exercise to go from a system of buses to a system of light rail and buses that need to be serviced and certified for use every 6 weeks. And, and then you're dealing with like all of the changing seasons, and then the tension between like your elected officials and your public servants, which anyone knows in government, once you have a new government, that tension, there is a new relationship that you need to build. So I feel like we sometimes undersell or we play down the complexity of these systems. And so it may seem, when you have someone who's very good at explaining a complex system in a simple term, then why wouldn't you think you can flick a switch and launch a new payroll system? That would seem really obvious. And then so understandable, well, maybe not understandable, but then when you have all of these hiccups afterwards, like I feel like there needs to be onus on both parts that this is a complex system, there will be bugs. We seem to be unforgiving. Is that like, what do you think? Are we unforgiving when it comes to technology?
I think we're unforgiving in general, maybe. It reminds me of the allegory of a bunch of blindfolded people touching different parts of an elephant and insisting on them being different things. And I think when a big and complex system, you only experience, one little corner of it, and the bus is late, or I can't log into this website. This should be that easy. I've done that. I've done, a little bit of web development, and I look at something and I go, why doesn't this work? I could make something that works like this, but obviously I can't make the entire system. And I think that same thing kind of goes for transit, is this idea of you experience a very small part and then you project its simplicity onto the whole thing.
That's a great way of putting it. I think around like decisions, around like big investment decisions, like investing in a big transit system or investing in a really big government IT project. I haven't seen people make the case for this, but it's this like idea in my head that we should try to make projects that are small enough that they fit into, the cycles of the same people being there, which is something that doesn't happen with, a 10-year transit project will go through like 2 or 3 city governments, 2 or 3 provincial governments, 2 or 3 federal governments, and a change at one of those is potentially enough to like, bring it off the rails. The same thing with government IT programs. Senior government executives move from one department to another every 2 or 3 years, and an IT project that takes 6 or 7 years is long enough that no one will feel the kind of ownership over it that like in a tech company, like Toby Lutke is really invested in Shopify working well. Steve Jobs was like, the software has to work, the hardware has to work, it all has to work together. And government executives that are responsible for IT programs don't have that same level of like existential, like, it's got to work and I'm here to make it work. They're just like, well, this is a 7-year project. I'm here between years 3 and 5. I'm not going to see it start. I'm not going to see it finish. Doesn't really affect me. And I think that is one of the reasons why it's like, a thing can, fail catastrophically, but no one was really owning whether it worked or not. And so everyone can just sort of be like, well, I wasn't on deck when it blew up, so it's not my problem. And I think the lesson to that is like, either you try to stop people from changing jobs, which isn't really fair to them, or you just try to make all these projects way smaller so that it's like the start and the finish of the project is in 1.5 years, and it's the same people around the whole time who are invested in it, who can like see how it's going, actually want it to succeed. I don't know what it takes to get there, but that's sort of like a thought in my head for sure.
That's a really interesting idea. I think that's the first time. Yeah, it's an interesting idea, and it would be interesting to see what it takes to get there. And certainly, and maybe it's possible in technology. My mind immediately goes to, like 30, 40, 50-year science projects where I don't know how you develop a long-term data set and demonstrate climate changing if your project is 18 months, because you will not have significant data. But what it does raise for me is, this idea of path dependency, because we haven't talked yet about, the decisions that we take inform the decisions, like inform future decisions. And so, to Willem's point, you look at a website and you say, like, why isn't this working? Well, we don't know what that company did beforehand. We don't know why they ended up with the website that they do. And that like, this may be the best smoldering pile of garbage they could manage based on what they did in the 6 years leading up to it. And they're actually really proud of it. Who knows? I mean, there's all kinds of examples like that, but then if you reduce every project to 18 months, that occurs to me that it would create greater demand to understand what happened immediately beforehand and what's coming next. And then do you put the onus on those teams, to hand things over in such a way that it's clear what the long-term vision is? So I'm sorry I talked over the last minute because that we're right up against the button. And so I'm going to take the opportunity to thank you all three for joining us this evening.